Good afternoon. I'm Anthony Wuto, and I currently serve as the Provost and Chief Academic Officer of Howard University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event. The Gwendolyn and Colbert King Endowed Chair in Public Policy was supported by a generous gift from Gwendolyn and Colbert King, and this year, the chair is Mr. James Comey. Mr. Comey is joined by his wife, Patrice, and is an alum of the College of William and Mary, where he received his bachelor's degree in 1982. He then completed a law degree at the University of Chicago in 1985, and while we were in the green room, I overheard him saying that while he was in law school, he served in the legal aid clinic. He, unlike other students who were pursuing opportunities with journals, he decided he wanted to serve in a legal aid clinic, and he became addicted to the difference he was making in the lives of the people that he was touching. He also served as an assistant U.S. attorney, ultimately serving as U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, and was appointed into that position shortly after 9/11. Following his service for the country, he joined the private sector where he served as general counsel and senior vice president for Lockheed Martin. In 2013, he was appointed the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation by President Barack Obama, where he served until 2017. One of the comments I also overheard him making as he was having a conversation with a couple of our students is that we have to learn to disagree without being disagreeable. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. James Comey, the 2017-18 Gwendolyn and Colbert King Endowed Chair in Public Policy. And I also want to welcome Ms. King, who is in the rear, and I always want to acknowledge her and her husband for their generous support of the university and this program. And so without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Comey.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here this evening. This is one of the highlights of my entire career, to have an opportunity to be on this campus and to have the conversations I hope we're going to have over the next 9 months. It is also an honor to be holding a chair in the name of Gwen and Colby King. I will do my absolute best not to embarrass their good name, especially my friend Gwen King's. She contacted me through a friend. I think it might have been the afternoon I was fired, maybe it was the next day, to ask me whether I would be interested in coming to have conversations at Howard. And as I tried to explain at convocation, I had similar entreaties from elite universities around the United States. I'm not going to name them because I don't want to embarrass them, because I blew them off. I blew them off because I believed, and Gwen believed, that there would be no more interesting place than Howard University to have conversations about anything that touch public policy, but especially about what I want to talk about, which is law enforcement and race. And so I'm already glad that I'm here, and I hope tonight will be a down payment on at least 5 conversations that we'll have where I will get smarter and I hope be useful to you as well. After talking to students and faculty, I have decided to devote all of the sessions that I will either speak in, facilitate, develop, or be part of to the hard questions about law enforcement and race. One of the things I hope you will tell me tonight is what you think that should look like. I have an idea for what this will be and the next one will be, but I'd like feedback on what we should talk about going into, especially into the spring semester. Since August of 2014, when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, questions of law enforcement and race have been at the forefront in American life. And I believe, on the whole, that's a very good thing, despite the fact that the conversations are rooted in tragedy. But I have noticed that since the election of our current president, they have not had the place in American life that I saw in late 2014, throughout 15, throughout 16. And I don't know exactly why that is. I suppose maybe it's because we haven't had the spate of cases involving the use of deadly force against black people by law enforcement? Maybe. I suppose maybe it is that we've made some progress over the last 2.5 years at bridging the gap, the divide between law enforcement and people of color. But honestly, I doubt those are the explanations. I really do. I think the most likely explanation is that issues involving the new administration, including the emergence of appalling voices of white nationalism and racism, have crowded out the topic of law enforcement from American public life. And although I think it is vital that we confront racism when it comes at us in the form of torch marches or racism or hate crimes, it is critical that we not lose sight of the issue that we began discussing in earnest as a country 2.5 years ago, because issues around law enforcement and race will be with us when this administration passes into history, which will happen. So I am fortunate to be here to help facilitate and to join conversations about that issue, law enforcement and race, which is an umbrella that captures an awful lot of difficult and complicated questions that I hope we can talk about and have conversations about. Let me start by defining conversation, which I tried to do at Convocation. I'm going to speak for just a short time now. My goal in speaking is to introduce to you and to those who may be watching us online how I think about these issues, and to help frame and advance conversations that will then follow, tonight for sure, and then in the weeks and months to come. A conversation is too rare a thing in American life right now. A conversation is where we each speak and we each listen. And here's the hard part, where we each listen to the other with an ear toward being convinced by that other. That is, we aren't just quiet while we wait for the speaker to finish so we can say what we plan to say all along. That's the Washington listen. Instead, we really listen, which means we push aside all the planned responses we might have arrived with, and we try to focus on what the person is actually saying and try to understand it with an open mind. We don't assume we know where the speaker's coming from. We don't fast forward in our mind to the part where I stomp this fool. We constantly stay in the moment and ask questions like this. So what is this guy trying to say here? Is this woman saying something different than I might have assumed she would be saying? One of my goals in coming to Howard is to learn. I can't learn unless I get me out of the way, because I actually obstruct my ability to learn. Because I have to get me out of the way and open my mind and really seep myself in the notion that I may not know something, that you may have perspectives that have never occurred to me. You may have facts that I've never come across before. You may have ways of framing an issue that actually never popped into my head. But to get to all of those things, I got to admit something that's really scary, especially for prominent people to admit. I do not know it all. I do not know enough. My perspective is limited. My reasoning is flawed. My facts are incomplete. My frameworks are outdated. That requires me to risk something, which is that you will figure out that I'm not so great. You will figure out that I don't know as much as maybe I pretend that I know. That is really hard for all people to do, and for me it is a lifelong journey. I hope you will take that journey with me. I came here to learn. I also came here to teach. And as odd as it may sound, I am not here to teach anyone at Howard to think the way that I do. That is not my goal. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. That's not really what I care about. At the end of the day, maybe after open-minded listening, of really trying to listen, you end up in the same place that you are today. That's okay. That's not my goal. Instead, my goal is to try to model, especially for students, how to have a conversation about really hard emotional things. How to listen with an ear toward being convinced, even if the person talking to you is somebody you think, I'm very unlikely to be convinced by what this guy says. Because it's only by all of us adopting that attitude, the attitude that, hey, you could be right and I could be wrong, that we have the best chance of learning something in a deep way. We may emerge from the conversation unchanged, but I'll tell you, we will have learned someone else's perspective, someone else's reasoning, someone else's facts, and that will equip us to be better leaders and better people. So, I hope to teach that even if people see the world very differently from each other, they can also work together to make that complicated world a better place. to find solutions together that can make progress. We are in a dangerous place in this country right now, where we hate too quickly, where disagreement becomes anger too quickly. The beauty of this wonderful and complicated and flawed country of ours is our diversity. It is that we see the world differently from each other. That is the strength of America, and always has been. We are never going to agree about all things. And in fact, if we did, that would be a sign of decline. There is power in our difference. There is power in the energy we bring to our disagreements, to our creativity, but only if we can disagree in productive ways. We need to separate those things that are worthy of our hatred, and I put racism at the top of that list, from those things that decent people can disagree about. I'm going to use, for these first two sessions, Birmingham, Alabama, as a point of reference. I'm going to do that because I know a bit about Birmingham, Alabama, both its past and its present. And its past has had a huge influence on me, as I'll explain to you. I think both the past of Birmingham and the present of Birmingham have a lot to teach us. And I intend to speak about Birmingham, especially its past, tonight, and then in November bring leaders from Birmingham to talk to you about Birmingham's effort in the midst of a difficult history to bridge gaps between law enforcement and communities of color. I first focused on Birmingham when I was in college. I had a weird mix in college. I was a chemistry major and a religion major. My family joked that I was pursuing alchemy. But I started to take some classes that changed me in college, and they were almost all in the religion department. One of them was a course called Significant Books in Western Religion, and it was a cool course. The entire semester was devoted only to 12 books. And one of them actually wasn't a book, it was a letter. It was Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. I believe that letter is the seminal work ever written about justice and humanity, and one of the most important things I've ever read. I've read it repeatedly over the years. Shortly after I became FBI director, I recommended the entire FBI read Letter from Birmingham Jail. Dr. King's message in that letter, which I hope you've read, is about achieving justice in an imperfect world. It's about striving for equality in a world that is inherently unfair. It's about our connections as people, as communities, as a country. You may know some of the more famous words from that letter. You may have seen them on the memorial on the Potomac Basin, but I want to read one in particular because I think it's so important today. Dr. King said this in Letter from Birmingham Jail. "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." I want to make sure I read that last one right. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Most Americans don't really know, and frankly couldn't really know, what it was like to live in Birmingham, Alabama in the early 1960s. Most people who weren't old enough in this country to understand what was going on then, or people who lived in different parts of the country or even different parts of Birmingham, couldn't know. And maybe even people who once knew have forgotten what it was like for men and women of color, for black people 50 years ago. Not just in Birmingham, Alabama. I'm going to focus on Birmingham. Separate schools, separate neighborhoods, separate lives. Police officers with clubs and tear gas and water hoses and dogs, state-sanctioned discrimination, explicit. And then the more insidious kind of discrimination, the quiet kind. Words never said, actions never taken, but silence that is deafening. It's hard to fully understand it unless you lived through it, unless you fought against it. I can't possibly understand fully. The people of Birmingham 50 years ago fought against racism and inequality and the powerful inertia of the status quo. They fought against people who said, be patient, change will come. But they also fought against what W.E.B. Du Bois called the peculiar indifference of good people. Good people who were living their lives, good people who couldn't begin to understand what the black community was going through, good people who didn't want to rock the boat, good people who failed to recognize that we are all tied together in that single garment of destiny, that they were part of it, whether they wanted to be part of it or not. We've made a whole lot of progress as a country since Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. But I don't have to tell you that it is not enough. We are a long way from where we need to be. We are a long way from, in the words of one of Dr. King's favorite pieces of scripture, and one of mine, the book of Amos, we're a long way from a point where justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. We still confront racism. We still confront discrimination. We still confront the status quo of separate lives. And we still confront the peculiar indifference of good people. The issues are different in many ways than they were 50 years ago, but in many ways they are not. To do something about it, we all have to take a hard look at who we are and who we want to be. 2 years ago, I talked about race and law enforcement at Georgetown University. I don't often get nervous giving speeches. I was really nervous before the Georgetown speech. I had struggled for months after Ferguson, trying to figure out, did I have something useful to say? Did I have something, because I'm the director of the FBI, that I could contribute? And I worried that how what I would say would be received. Could anybody talk openly about race, especially a white guy, in American life, in a life dominated by 140 characters, and do it in a way that didn't cause more pain and confusion than intended? And so I was nervous. Should I say something? Should I not say something? And then in January of 2015 came the assassinations of 2 New York City police officers, Rafael Ramos and Wenjun Liu, Latino and an Asian, sitting patrolling a historically black neighborhood, Bedford-Stuyvesant. President Obama asked me to go and represent him at one of the funerals, Officer Liu's funeral. And so I went. The pain in that small funeral home where I spoke very briefly was suffocating. And among the thousands and thousands of police officers who were lined up in the streets outside. And so as I stood there that day trying to say something useful to these folks, to the grieving family, it occurred to me that maybe I could contribute. Even though I am who I am, I look the way that I look, because I have a job that has a pulpit to it, and maybe I can use that pulpit to say some things I believe, and share some things that I believe to be true about human beings, and true about law enforcement in particular. And maybe by doing that, I could support a fuller, more informed conversation about where we are and where we need to go. I said at Georgetown that I believe that all of us, especially law enforcement, needs to understand 4 hard truths. The first thing I said was, we in law enforcement have to see ourselves clearly. We have to understand our history, much of which is not pretty. The truth about the history of law enforcement in the United States is that it was almost always the enforcer of the status quo, which was mighty rough on some folks, minority communities, immigrant communities, communities lacking power, most of all, the black community. We don't quite do the history justice, I think, when we use terms like minority communities or communities of color, because one color was treated far more brutally than any other color. People in law enforcement, I said at Georgetown, have to own that history and understand that history, because the people that they're supposed to serve and protect have internalized that history. They know it. So if you're going to work in that community, you better know it. The second hard truth I said is that research points to the existence of widespread implicit bias in all of us. Unconscious, maybe unintended, maybe contrary to what your heart is, but real. Research tells us that we all carry around various biases that cause us to react differently to a face that looks different than our own. That's a depressing fact, except biology is not destiny. By staring at it and owning at it, you realize what you do next in the face of bias that may be unconscious is what matters. The third thing I said is we have to understand the truth that something can happen to people in law enforcement, especially those working in vulnerable communities. Police officers often work in environments where a disproportionate percentage of street crime is committed by young men of color. And sometimes, for the cops who are working the overnight shift, all they see is pain and problems. Something can happen, I said, to people of goodwill in that environment. After years of work, police officers can be influenced by a certain cynicism that causes them to take mental shortcuts to make that truth as well. And the last thing I said, the last truth I tried to share, was that we all have to understand the truth that the problems we face as a society are greater than the divide between law enforcement and the people we're supposed to serve and protect. It's far harder than that. Law enforcement has to constantly work to improve. But the cops, I said, are not the root cause of our problems, especially in our most vulnerable neighborhoods. And they're also not the solution to the problems in our neighborhoods. You cannot arrest or police your way to a healthy neighborhood. A whole lot of people don't want to talk about that because the problems are so hard that they'd rather talk about something else. Instead, they should be talking about the police, they should be talking about education and employment and opportunity and community involvement and families and role models and drug treatment and mental health treatment and how to grow drug-resistant and violent-resistant kids in difficult circumstances. I was so pleased to read that President Obama is going to continue in his private life focusing on the program called My Brother's Keeper, which, as I understand it, is designed to focus especially on young men, predominantly young black men, and help them get the opportunities that most of us take for granted. That kind of work will help those young men never become part of a police officer's experience and shape that neighborhood in a great way. For its part, I said at Georgetown, and I've said hundreds of times since then, law enforcement officers need to feel the life experiences of those they serve. They have to work to see in a deep way what others may be seeing in them. They have to redouble their efforts to resist bias and prejudice, but as hard as it sounds and as undefined as it can be, they need to know the hearts of those that they're serving and protecting. They need to try and understand, so what is it like to be a 19-year-old African-American young man walking home from the library at night and encountering a police officer in uniform? What is he feeling? What has he been taught? What is he experiencing, even if it's something that that law enforcement officer has never imagined before? How does that officer communicate both respectfully and safely with that citizen? Police have to also try and understand what it's like to be a citizen who might worry that calling the police will make things worse. This is something that cops struggle to even picture because of what they know about themselves. How could someone fear calling me? I am a good person. It may not make any sense to them, but it is a reality. And they need to feel it with an open heart and an open mind, and then work to change that perspective. But it's a two-way street. Citizens really need to see what the police see through their windshields. They need to feel what they feel when they approach a car during a car stop late at night with tinted windows. They need to try and feel that officer's heart race when she goes up a flight of stairs responding to a domestic violence call, not knowing what she may see and encounter on the other side of that door. They need to try and put themselves in that officer's shoes. How is that officer experiencing the world? And they need to try and see the police officers who are quietly and professionally trying to help a neighborhood get better. If they take the time to see that, in my experience, they will overwhelmingly see police officers are human and they are flawed, because all human beings are, but they're overwhelmingly people who joined a profession that doesn't pay much dough and can be very dangerous because they want to make a difference. And they are devoting their lives to trying to help communities that a whole lot of America decides to drive around. And some of those communities, one of the things I want to talk about tonight, is some of those communities are changing in ominous ways over the last 3 years, which is essential that we confront. I hope we'll talk about it tonight after I frame the question. You heard that I graduated from the University of Chicago Law School. I lived on the south side of Chicago. When I graduated in '85, and I was leaving the south side of Chicago, the neighborhood was changing. And I didn't realize it at the time, nobody there did, but it was the first edge of a change that would transform a lot of communities in the United States. Kids were starting to shoot kids over crack cocaine, over turf. Gang wars were breaking out. Violence was becoming not yet epidemic in '85, but growing and growing and growing. And you know what it would grow into? It grew into a period, a generation or so ago, during which America's cities, particularly minority communities in those cities, experienced historic and horrific levels of violent crime. Together over the last generation, we have made as a country unimaginable progress against crime. We have produced safer neighborhoods. at tremendous cost to communities and to families. Now, all these years later, something is happening. We are seeing an increase in violent crime and especially murder. And some of our communities are once again in trouble. And it's trouble that is complicated and layered and very, very painful. And I believe can only be addressed by all of us refusing to drive around the problem and by talking about it together and working on it together. I see two lines. I see a line that is law enforcement, and I see a line that are the communities, especially communities of color, especially black communities in the United States, in many cities, that are two lines that are never together. But I actually see them farther apart than I've ever seen them before, and I actually see them arcing away from each other, especially over the last few years. Every incident that involves real police misconduct, or sometimes perceived misconduct, but every time citizens perceive abuse by the police, this line arcs this way. And every time a police officer is killed in the line of duty, especially in a killing that's targeted, this line arcs this way. And just as those lines are arcing away from each other, and maybe in some places because they're arcing away from each other, we are experiencing a sharp uptick in killing in some of our nation's most vulnerable neighborhoods. Something is happening. A whole lot more people are dying this year than last year, more last year than the year before, more that year than the year before. And I don't know why for sure. And I know these homicides, these increased murders, are happening in a very concentrated way. They're happening in communities of color. They're happening in the biggest cities in those communities. If you look at the nation's 50 or 60 largest cities, over 40 of them have seen sustained increase in homicide over the last 3 years. A quarter of those cities, I checked before I came here tonight, a quarter of those of our biggest cities are on track this year to have the highest murder totals they've had in 25 years. And they've had it in Birmingham, which you're going to hear about next month. In 2014, there were 59 murders in Birmingham. In 2015, there were 88 murders in Birmingham. In 2016, there were 104 murders in Birmingham, and it's up again this year. Now, some have attributed Birmingham's rising murder rate to violence related to the drug trade, or at least in part to poverty, or to changing drug trends. I don't know. That's something we're going to talk about. From city to city, something is happening. And I started staring at this map in 2015. I stared at a map and a calendar I could not make sense of. What is going on in the United States? That homicide is jumping only in some places, in some cities, next to another big city that's not seeing a jump, and it's all starting in the beginning of 2015. What on earth is going on? What is the connection between Birmingham and Baltimore, between Chicago and Kansas City, cities with different crime trends, cities with different gang problems? What is happening? And a whole lot of people have been asking and wrestling with answers to these questions, none to my satisfaction or to any of their satisfactions. It's important to stare at drugs and gangs. Is it heroin? Is that changing things? Are there more guns for some reason? Is social media making the way people interact and have conflict different than ever before? Is there something that's changed about the criminal justice system? I don't know. I doubt there is any single overriding cause. It's more likely the result of a combination of factors, including what I was just talking about. That chasm that separates law enforcement from the communities that law enforcement is supposed to serve. Now, some folks reacted really angrily to me when I raised this subject 2 years ago. I raised the possibility that some change in human behavior is contributing to the rise in violence. And oddly enough, by doing that, I managed to anger police unions and people on the left. Everybody said, it's just not possible, and how dare you ask that? It couldn't possibly be so, they told me. Now, I don't like the term Ferguson effect, and despite the fact that lots of media have reported that that's my term, that is not my term. It's not a term that I use. But I hope one of the things we can discuss over the next 9 months is whether it's possible that people change their behavior, both cops and the community, in response to highly publicized events. That's not a criticism of surveillance of cops. That's not a criticism of accountability. That's a question. Could people change their behavior in ways that have profound consequences in response to the way they perceive the world? Now, sometimes I hear people, especially academics, say, you know, it's not that big a deal. because the increases are coming off historic lows. Or it's just a blip. There'll likely be a reversion to the mean. I cannot think of it as a blip. I think of it as young men dying. Maybe it'll go away in a couple years, but we cannot wait to confront it. Maybe there'll be a reversion to the mean after hundreds more people are killed. Too many people are dying now, and caring, intelligent people need to demand answers to why, with open minds and open hearts. Hundreds of people are being murdered this year in Chicago and Baltimore. Baltimore's on track to have its all-time record this year. But to be specific, which the media often isn't, more black people are being murdered. It is hard to get killed in Chicago if you're white. And I'll tell you this, people aren't getting killed on the Miracle Mile. They're not getting killed on Michigan Avenue downtown where the tourists are. These spikes in violence are happening in what you could call cities within cities, because over here is a safe city where people can wash their cars in the street, sit on the porch in the evening and walk their dogs, and their kids can play. And over here is a city where parents are afraid to let their kids play outside, where there's no sitting on the stoop in the evening, where good education is an uphill battle and every corner risks becoming a war zone. Most people in America can drive around those cities and choose to live in these cities. We live apart from the violence because we don't live in that city within a city. We can escape it. We can think, hey, that's not my neighborhood. That's happening to those people over there. But these neighborhoods belong to all of us. And it is our problem, not just cops, not just teachers or city council members or ministers or other community leaders, but every citizen in this country, no matter what their role or what they look like. The same citizens who tend to show that peculiar indifference to something that's not part of their reality, and we are all guilty of that. But when that kind of violence becomes part of everyday existence, where, for heaven's sake, the Chicago Tribune on Monday runs a body count for what happened over the weekend, and the number keeps growing and growing, everyone pays a price. As Dr. King said, everyone is affected indirectly by those who are affected directly. And it will take everyone to make it right. I think if Dr. King were with us today, he would help us have the conversations we need to have between law enforcement and the communities they serve and protect, especially communities of color. I think he would tell us that we have to open our hearts and our minds and see each other more clearly, because it's hard to hate up close. It's hard to hate somebody you know, somebody whose life you've come to understand and to live in your mind's eye. And only by getting close to each other do we have any chance of arcing those lines back together. We simply have to start to do this in this country. And another way to arc those lines back together is through transparency and accountability in law enforcement. First, we must have better data in this country. And I know data is a boring word, so you're probably tuning out right now. Stay with me, because data means facts, and facts help us find truth and understanding. We can't address issues like use of force by the police, officer-involved shootings, or why violent crime is spiking in some places if we don't know the circumstances, if we don't have the information to talk about it. We need to improve the way this nation, this great sophisticated nation of ours, reports, analyzes, and uses crime statistics and police use of force statistics. That information has to be accurate, it has to be timely, and it has to be accessible to everybody, or it doesn't do us any good. I've said this before, and I'm sure I offended people in law enforcement by saying it, but I'm going to say it again. It's ridiculous and frightening that in the United States of America in 2017, we do not know how many people were shot by the police last week, last month, or last year. We live in a country where you can find out how many books were sold on Amazon without ever leaving your laptop. You can find out how many people showed up at a hospital picket in Houston with the flu last weekend. But you cannot find out in any authoritative way from the government how many times police officers shot and killed people in this country. Without that information about police interactions, every conversation about law enforcement's use of force and law enforcement in general in this country is uninformed. And that is a terrible place to be about something that important. Until I was fired, I was pushing for a more modern system of collecting data about police use of deadly force in this country. I wanted it from every local department, every state department, every tribal department, every federal department. And you know what? The leaders of all police organizations agreed with me because they understand we can't have a productive conversation if we don't know what happened. People of good faith believe there's an epidemic of violence by police officers in uniform against men of color. I have no idea. How on earth could the director of the FBI not be able to know that? We have to fix that in this country. And I'm confident that even though I'm not there, the momentum was such by the time I left, it will be done. It's going to take time, probably another 24 months, but we will have that data available so we can figure out, so what's going on, and where is it good, and where is it bad, and how do we fix the problems that we see? Another thing we can do in law enforcement is better reflect the communities that we serve. Now, I don't want to stand here as a former employee of one of the world's largest glass houses and talk to you about diversity. Until recently, as you know, I was the leader of the FBI, an organization whose special agent cadre had been growing steadily and steadily more white and slightly more male year after year after year for about 12 years. And by the time I became director, it was 83% white. Now, I got no problem with white people. Tall, awkward, male white people from New York are fine, in my view. But if all we have is me, and I explained this to the FBI many, many times. It's why I made diversity one of the core values of the FBI. If all we got is me, we are less effective. We lack perspective, we lack wisdom that more eyes and more life experience could bring to our exercise of power. We are more credible, and we make better decisions when we are different than 83%. And so I set about to try and change the FBI. And it was hard. One of my daughters summed up the challenge, said, "Dad, the problem is you're the man," which I thought was a compliment at first. And then she said, "No, I don't mean it in a good way, Dad. The problem is you're the man. Who would want to work for the man?" And I said, "You know what? You're right, but you're wrong. If you understood what these men and women are like and what they do, I don't care what you look like, you'd want to be part of it." We started holding diversity recruiting events around the country, and we invited lawyers of color under the age of 35, engineers, and MBAs. And we went and talked to these young people and I said, "I dare you to be part of this life of meaning. I dare you to find out what this organization is really like. I know the history of this organization, and I've mandated it be studied, but I also know what it's like today. I dare you to be part of this." The yield from those events was extraordinary. We had started changing the FBI. We had a class at Quantico that was 38% non-white. Unheard of for the FBI. So unheard of, I accused them of hiring actors. They assured me they had not. The FBI was changing, and I believe will continue to change, because I don't think the momentum can be lost. Every part of American law enforcement has to do that. Get out and show the true heart of American law enforcement, and dare people of talent, especially people of color and women, to be part of this. Because only by bringing that perspective to bear are we truly going to change American law enforcement. So, and by the way, at my convocation address, which I don't know whether you could hear, there was a group of Howard alums who run the diversity initiative for me at FBI who came to celebrate their continued success. So let me finish by talking about what I hope to do. We are ordinary people capable of extraordinary things. We are people who can do those things when we stand together. Now, when people study or read about the civil rights movement, they think about Dr. King or Medgar Evers or Malcolm X or John Lewis or Rosa Parks or James Farmer or Bayard Rustin, the big marquee names. And that's good. But all of you know, I'm sure, what a lot of Americans don't seem to realize is that those big important names were joined by hundreds and thousands of foot soldiers. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. People who walked calmly down a street, dressed in their Sunday best, calling for equality. People who held hands and crossed a bridge, knowing they were walking into savagery on the other side of that bridge, because they believed they could make the world change. They were people who risked their lives to take a stand and to right a wrong. During one of my visits to Birmingham, I had the chance to meet a man named Bishop Calvin Woods, an amazing person. In the early 1960s, Bishop Woods was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor for simply speaking out to his congregation about segregated buses. He told his congregation that if you paid your fare, there's no reason you can't sit or ride where you want. And he would not shut up. Even when they put him at hard labor for 6 months, he continued to organize sit-in demonstrations at lunch counters and to lead demonstrations in prayer. He kept marching, he kept peacefully protesting because of his fellow citizens. Because despite the beatings, the jailings, and the bombings, the spirit and determination of the black people of Birmingham could not be destroyed. And Calvin Woods embodied that. These were people who understood deep down in their very souls what Dr. King meant when he said, we are all tied together in a single garment of destiny. But there's another example from Birmingham that I learned that I want to share with you. Another person who got this was a guy named Charles Morgan. Now, you've probably never heard of Charles Morgan, but he was an ordinary 33-year-old white guy. He lived in Birmingham, and he was a lawyer, and he was a member of the Birmingham Men's Business Club. Whites only. We may have assumed, when you look at a Charles Morgan, he's one of those dudes with the normal peculiar indifference of good people. But on September 16th, 1963, the day after Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley were killed in the attack on the 16th Street Baptist Church, Morgan did an extraordinary thing, especially for a guy from his background. He went to a meeting of the Young Men's Business Club in Birmingham, and he stood up, and he said something that I want to read to you. He said, 4 little girls were killed in Birmingham yesterday. A mad, remorseful, worried community asked, who did it? Who threw the bomb? The answer should be, he said, we all did it. The one who threw the bomb is every individual who spreads the seeds of his hate to his neighbor and his son. And then he sat down. Now, Charles Morgan didn't win many friends that day, and he didn't change any minds at the Birmingham Young Men's Business Club. And for his effort, he and his family got a whole lot of death threats, and not long after the bombing, he had to close his law practice and flee Birmingham, which he said was one of the best things that ever happened to him because it moved him into a life of representing and speaking for the powerless. But that guy, 33-year-old white guy at the Young Men's Business Club, did not need to stand up. He could have continued to drive around that problem. The bombing didn't happen at his church or in his neighborhood. But as Dr. King said, Charles Morgan could no longer be an outsider. People in this room, on this campus, know better than most that today's civil rights struggle is not over. In many ways, the struggle is broader today and more far-reaching. In many ways, it's even harder because folks assume that it's over. We fixed that mess in the 1960s. I believe it will take all of us, every single member of every community, especially those that are suffering, to fight for change, to fight for equality and fairness, to stop driving around the problem, to be the agitators and insiders in the best way, in the way Dr. King taught us. I believe we each have a responsibility to see one another up close, to stand for justice and to sow peace whenever and wherever we can, to strengthen the fabric that ties us together into that single fabric, that single garment of destiny, to work together for solutions that produce lasting change. I hope you're here because you care enough to participate in conversations to try to achieve some of that over the next 9 months. I thank you for being part of this. I thank you for the conversations we will have going forward. I'm honored to be with you here at Howard. Thank you for listening to me. traveled around, I started asking people, what's going on? What is happening? And I started to hear little private conversations with police chiefs and police officers and people in the community that something is changing in the way police officers are interacting with the community. So I thought, what could that be? How could that be? And to my mind, it wasn't, the reason the term Ferguson effect confuses me is Ferguson wasn't about videos. And Ferguson is a complicated and difficult subject, but what I kept hearing was having an impact, especially on police officers, were the viral videos showing the killing of Walter Scott, for example. And the police officers were saying to each other in roll call, and their families were saying to them, don't you dare become famous. Don't you dare get famous or dead. Don't become part of something like that. And I met privately with a bunch of police officers in a major American city in the Midwest. And I said, what's going on? What are you all feeling? And they said, you know what, we're doing our jobs. We're responding to 911 calls. But at 1 o'clock in the morning, are we going to get out and talk to a group of guys on the street corner? No, we're not. Because when we get out of the car, everybody videotapes us. We don't want to be famous. So first I ignored it and said, that's silly. And the more I heard about it, I thought, you know what? Given what I know about human beings, because what I know about human beings, and I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about this because I worry people have misunderstood me, and there's a danger in this metaphor, which I have not tried out on the media, but I'd like to share it with you. It's baseball time. Think about what you know about human beings. If in major leagues, in baseball, there were a series of horrific injuries to batters from pitchers throwing at their heads and hitting them in the face, and you saw illegal, unlawful, inappropriate pitching like that, and then the Umpires Association announced they were going to crack down on it, and you saw the videos over and over and over again at ESPN, what would happen? I think knowing people, what would happen is pitchers would start moving the ball in, right? Because I'm not going to hit it. I don't intend to hit a batter, but I'm going to move the ball in. Lawful pitching involves pitching on the inside of the plate. It's not lawful to hit a batter. But I think what would happen is pitchers would start to move the ball, and you would see it. You'd see its impact, more hits and more runs in Major League Baseball. Then over time, it would drift back. And so the more I stared at this and the more I heard from law enforcement officers, I thought, you know what? Someone's got to call it out and ask whether there is a change in human behavior. So the first thing I called out is, are the cops acting differently? And this infuriated the police. This is something sometimes folks on the protest side don't realize how angry at me the police were, saying I was calling them cowards. And I said, no, I'm calling you human beings. Are you reacting in some way that's changing this neighborhood? Because policing involves getting up close in a respectful, appropriate way. We all want that kind of policing. And if you're staying in your cars, is that having an impact on the neighborhood? I don't know. But someone has to have the courage to talk about it. And I said to myself, I have a 10-year term. I forgot that I could be fired, but I have a 10-year term. I'm going to raise this difficult subject. And then I had more conversations over the next 12 months. And even though people were angry, I said, I'm still going to raise the issue because I've actually gotten wiser. A number of people from communities around the country said, you know, you may be onto something, but there's another dimension that you're missing. People in the community, when they watch those videos and see the way police act around the country, they're pulling back from the police. And so the vital information in a neighborhood, I saw Joe drop the gun, or you ought to go check on Frank. That vital information you get, you're not getting anymore because the community is seeing this and pulling back. And the chasm is widening in both directions, and that is changing behavior with dire consequences. So as I said in my speech, I don't know whether this explains the entire thing. The term Ferguson effect doesn't make a lot of sense to me for the reasons I said, but I think we got to continue to ask ourselves, because we're dealing with human beings, is there some change in behavior? And it's not a criticism of any of the groups, right? I don't blame people in the community for reacting a certain way to videos. I don't blame police officers for being risk-averse in a way. And it's not a criticism of videos. I'm a huge fan of accountability and transparency. I think it's very important that all police departments experiment with body cameras to offer additional transparency. And there's complications with that we can talk about. It's not about that. It's about trying to figure out, is something changing, the result of which is less policing and more death in America, especially in America's cities. So I hope that's useful to you.
Second question was from a student who tweeted us, and he said, from Razik Brown, Senior Human Development Major from Bronx, New York. His question was, how do you feel about the FBI disproportionately keeping tabs on civil organizations led by people of color, but paying little to no attention to white terrorist groups?
If that were the truth, I'd be very concerned. That's not the reality. The FBI spends an enormous amount. The FBI has two divisions to its counterterrorism operation, one international, one domestic. The domestic terrorism work is dominated by a focus on white supremacist groups, sovereign citizens group, militia groups. Again, we have to be very careful, not people who are speaking about how bad the government is or saying we ought to do away with the U.S. Constitution, but people who are advocating and moving towards violence. Now, there are groups of people, a very small proportion of that work, that are non-white, that are black or Latino or white with a particular cultural background. We've long had a focus on Irish heritage Americans who may be shipping weapons to Northern Ireland and may be used to kill police officers. That's work the FBI has to do. But the predication is not just you say things that we may find disagreeable, but that you work towards acts of violence to accomplish your ends. And so it's not true, and I hope the person who tweeted is following this. It's simply not true that a big part of the FBI's domestic terrorism work is focused on people of color.
Our next question was from a student, a freshman human development major from Philadelphia, Luke Risher. What is the FBI's role in stamping out white terrorism?
Well, I don't want to repeat what I just said. The FBI's domestic terrorism, which is a big component of it at headquarters and then in each of our 56 field offices, is designed to focus on groups that are moving towards or engaging in acts of violence based on some ideology, which includes white racism, and disrupting them, figuring out who they are and trying to make criminal cases against them to put them in jail to stop it.
So those concludes the questions from our hashtag HUXComey Twitter discussion, as well as the Google form that we allowed students to submit their questions to. So I'm going to open it up to the floor if anybody in the audience has a question for Honorary James Comey. Yes.
So you said that the fourth argument you listed was that the problem is very...
He's going to give you a microphone.
So you said the fourth hard truth was that the problems are greater than law enforcement and race, correct?
Correct.
And then you stated that there's issues with education, mental health resources, employment, things like that.
Correct.
Okay, so I'm wondering, how do you address capitalism and the state's role in creating those problems that are greater than just law enforcement and race?
See if I can give you an intelligent answer to a hard question. I'm sure that the nature and structure of America's institutions, including our capitalist, market-driven economy, are an important contributor. I think it's probably more complicated than that because the intersection of our market economy with institutions, governmental institutions, state, local, and federal, is an important reason why those neighborhoods are so starved of capital, of education, of the resources they need. But I'm sure in a free market economy, if all you do is let dollars speak, then the people without the dollars won't have much ability to speak or to make change. So that's probably the best I can do on that. If I gave a dumb answer, poke at me and give me a follow-up question. Okay.
And my question is, beyond these conversations, how do you plan to, I guess, keep the ball moving and get momentum on, like I said, moving beyond the conversations and actually tackling the issues of which we're speaking?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know yet. And one of the reasons that I'm so excited about the conversations is to get ideas for how I didn't expect to be a private citizen, frankly. I was doing a lot in the government that we haven't even talked about at FBI. I no longer have that power, so how can I be useful? One of the things that's occurred to me is I'm writing a book about ethical leadership, and that book's going to be published in the spring, and then I'm going to travel all around the country and speak about ethical leadership. And I'm hoping that one of the ways I can be useful to the country is take some of the perspectives that I've learned here and build them into what I talk about. to try and help people of goodwill around the country think about things in a different way. But I honestly don't know yet. It's one of the reasons I'm excited to be here is to have smart people tell me how they think I can help. And anytime you want to throw a suggestion at me, do it. But you don't have to have one now. You're doing the pointing, right? Okay.
Hello.
In the instance that you see the police pulling back from assisting local communities, who should they look to defend them or protect them in instances, especially like Charlottesville, where the police officers were literally told not to engage and help the people who were dealing with white supremacy and terrorism?
I believe there is no substitute in an ordered society for law enforcement. And so if law enforcement is not policing in the way the community expects, then the answer is not for the community to take up arms to protect itself. It's for them to shout to the heavens that the work is not being done that they want. I encouraged communities when I was still at FBI. I said 2 things need to happen. Police commanders need to push their officers towards that street corner, and the leaders of that community who have political power need to demand and pull with their words those officers out of those cars onto those street corners. But I do not think it's a sensible substitute for communities to try and create their own ability to use force to police. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yes.
How do we address the peculiar indifference of good people within the law enforcement?
How do we address the peculiar indifference?
Indifference of good people, like you quoted, in law enforcement.
Sorry, I heard it, but does he have to say it again for the, yeah, sorry, it's for the people watching online.
How do you address the peculiar indifference of good people within law enforcement?
Well, a number of different ways. When you're in law enforcement, by leading, understanding the danger of peculiar indifference and forcing the kind of up-closeness that I talked about, ensuring that your officers know the community that they police, know the people of the community they police. And I said something, I hope you caught it. There's a real danger in officers who work overnight because most of the folks are asleep. Right? The mothers would otherwise be pushing children in strollers are asleep. And so you can get a warped view of a community from only working overnight. So it's incumbent upon police leaders to make sure those officers come to understand there's a whole lot of good people in this community who are sound asleep at 4 o'clock in the morning. And lots of different ways like that, but it's a question of leadership. And the will is there. I have met, I think, every police chief of a major American city, and these are people who understand what progressive policing is and understand the importance of making sure their officers get up close to people. That's the simplest answer for me. I meant what I said. It's hard to hate up close. 50 yards away, people can shout at each other and have preconceptions about each other. You get up this close and see the humanity in somebody, it's hard to hate up close. So that to me is the most important thing a leader can do with the police. There's lots of other training that comes with that and recruiting and all that stuff, but training is necessary but nowhere near sufficient. Culture is best defined as the way things are really done around here no matter what they tell you in training. You can't train your way to a healthy organization. You have to model your way to a healthy organization. It's all the informal around that training that makes the difference between it becoming internalized and just something we have to do. And so that's a leadership question in my mind.
Good evening. You mentioned that we need more data when it comes to looking at crime statistics and understanding what's going on. However, where does qualitative data come in? Where does the one-on-one interviews, the focus group discussions, where does that come in? And does that have a role in understanding the rise in the homicides that you mentioned in certain communities?
I think absolutely. I think you got to have both. Just the dry data alone, you may miss a richness that you'll pick up in focus groups and in action research, but you got to have the data as well, because without having the aggregate data to see trends over time, all the interviews in the world aren't going to give you a picture that you can act on, at least in my experience. So I'd say you got to have both.
profiting from their murders of unarmed black people through campaigns such as GoFundMe?
I couldn't hear the last bit.
What is your opinion on people like George Zimmerman and Darren Wilson profiting from their murders of unarmed black people through campaigns such as GoFundMe?
Oh, GoFundMe? I don't think I know enough about that to answer, but I can give you a general answer. I don't like it when anyone who's engaged in wrongdoing benefits from their wrongdoing. The challenging part is we're a nation that's grounded on due process. So if you haven't been convicted of a crime, there isn't much government can do to deprive you of the fruits that you derive from the conduct that led to the conviction. I believe in being very aggressive at pursuing people who have been found guilty of something, who are looking to profit on it, but it's harder in our society, for reasons that I think make sense, looked at from 50,000 feet, that when someone hasn't been convicted of a crime, there's no legal hook to prevent them from collecting it. Now, morally, I don't like it.
According to Trevor Aronson's book, The Terror Factory, Inside the NBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism, only 1% of people arrested in the decade following 9/11 were actual threats, and as many as 30 times more were induced by the FBI to behave in ways that prompted their arrest. If the FBI is coercing people into becoming criminals, does that not make the FBI a criminal organization?
Well, if the FBI were coercing people into criminal activity, the FBI would be violating the law. And so I've heard that a lot, people saying the FBI entraps people into committing crimes. I think, honestly, that is baloney and is not borne out by all the cases. None of the cases the FBI made after 9/11 was there a successful entrapment defense advanced. Now, maybe you can say, well, the entrapment defense maybe is too hard to make, but none of them. The FBI has too much work to do to go around finding people who have no interest in terrorism and convincing them to engage in terrorism. The Bureau's focus is on people who have the means and the inclination. And so you will see, if you do the research on some of the cases, our standard practice was somewhere along the line, give the person an off-ramp. Because we do not want to be wasting our time on people who are either mentally off or just playing a game. And so say to them, are you sure you want to go through with this? Let's bag this. And then see what they say. And invariably, the people who are charged say, heck yeah, I want to go through with this. I want to go kill people. And as I say to folks, what would you have us do in that circumstance where someone is saying that? We had to pursue it. So it's a legitimate concern. The cases don't bear out the concern, though.
Good evening. With the topic of your lectures being law enforcement and race, and in response to your mantra of open-mindedness, do you plan on seeking beyond your lectures, like in Afro-American classroom settings at Howard, to learn more about race, specifically the black race, instead of law enforcement, which you are clearly educated on?
Yes, I'd welcome suggestions for how I can do that. I'm going to be visiting a number of different classes. I spent 2 hours yesterday getting drilled by a class of second-year law students at Howard. And so I would welcome suggestions. You have an idea for something you think I should expose myself to? Just send me an email. I'm on the Howard email system. Probably just made a big mistake, but but seriously, I'm not kidding. If you think there's something that I should see, I should back up, tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a white guy. I was raised in a community that was almost entirely white from 5th grade on. There was one black family that actually lived on my street. And I didn't know much about black people, have much contact with black people until I went to college. And through, I think, happenstance, I was assigned to live in a suite with a same age, a guy, black guy from a single parent household in inner city Philadelphia. And that changed my life. Getting to know Greg Sampson, who's still a friend, he's a judge in West Baltimore now, changed my life. It started with how we got to campus. My parents drove me. We stayed in a Motel 6, I think. My mother cried and hugged me, and they made sure I had my room all decorated and everything, then drove off together. Greg Sampson's mom couldn't do that. She put all his belongings in a green duffel bag, put him on a bus, and he went to campus. First time he'd ever been there. He gets off. He walks onto the campus, true story, he knocks on the first building he sees. It's the president's house. The president opens the door and he says, I'm Greg Sampson, I'm here. And the president says, I'm sorry. Our lives were so different, and had I not met him, my life would have remained in a separate way. And so I've been trying to understand not just black people, but lots of people different than me. What are they like and how do they see the world differently? And there's lots of ways I've tried to do that since that moment. I did something crazy at college that Sampson inspired me to do. I wrote a 3-part series for the newspaper on the experience of blacks at William & Mary. And I tried to interview every black student at William & Mary. Wasn't impossible because there were only 240 of them, but I talked to nearly everyone and surveyed the rest to try and represent their experience. So it's a lifelong journey for me, and if you can find ways, classes I should go to, things I should read, throw them at me on the email.
So is there a question in the back?
Hi everyone, how are you? This is Guy. I'm happy that there's a good amount of people here. So my question,
I think you need it, though, for the people watching
Okay.
online.
So my question is, coming to America, well, not even just coming to America, coming to Howard and being more privy to, different issues that occur because of law enforcement and race, like those two meeting in the middle. The question that I've always constantly asked myself, and I'd like to hear your opinion on it, is, how do you feel as though police officers, understand their duty? Meaning that, if you decide to serve and protect, and you decide that you're going to, put your life on the line by becoming a police officer or by, pursuing a career in law enforcement, why is it then, when we start to have these conversations about why all these young black men are getting shot down in the streets, we start talking about, oh, well, police officers may have felt uncomfortable. Like, I understand, we're all human and, people do feel uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, it's like if you take on the responsibility to kind of serve and protect and to, put your life on the line every single day in order to serve and protect. Like, I just find it very frustrating that the conversation turns around and becomes, well, police officers, may feel uncomfortable, just how you may feel uncomfortable with a police officer. I don't know. I'd love to hear your opinion on it.
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful question. And I tried to convey some of this in my remarks. I think, first of all, I think that I have never met anyone who joined law enforcement to help white people. I've never met anyone. I'm sure there are racist, hardcore racists in all parts of American life, including law enforcement. In my experience, there are people who signed up because they want to help people. And their view is when the 911 call comes, I never ask what the person looks like, I go. And so I think they start and remain throughout their careers people who are motivated in a way you'd want them to be motivated. I meant what I said. I think life experience can shape all of us. One thing that happens in law enforcement is I must get home to my family becomes incredibly important. Law enforcement officers routinely, for reasons you understand, law enforcement officers routinely have a greeting to each other or a salutation when their shifts are changing. They'll say something like, "Stay safe out there. Stay safe out there." And each incident where a law enforcement officer is killed looms incredibly large in the mind of a law enforcement officer. And so there's a risk that they're approaching engagements with the default being, I have to protect myself. I must get home at the end of this shift. So there's a risk that when that's your mindset, that you read everything you see in terms of that filter. That everything you see is viewed through, is it a threat to me? And how is it coming at me? 1. 2, it's an absolute fact that many police officers in America's cities spend a lot of their days encountering and locking up young men of color, right? That's a whole other complicated topic we can talk about. That's a fact in a lot of America's largest cities. It's not true across the country, but in a lot of the major jurisdictions. And that can have a warping effect on people. I'll tell you another warping effect that's separate from race. Nearly everybody charged with a federal crime is convicted. The conviction rate is 90-some%. And nearly everybody denies that they're guilty, at least initially. And so there's a risk, to me as a prosecutor, that I'll be skewed by that and assume everybody's guilty, and everybody who says they're not guilty is full of nonsense, right? It's baloney, everybody's guilty. That's a dangerous warping effect. I remember when I first became a prosecutor, I saw crime everywhere. I would go down the street and I'd see a lady opening her trunk, holding shopping bags, and a man standing behind her. It's a kidnapping, right? He's forcing her into the trunk. No, she's not. But my view of the war, I start to see the world through these very, very dark glasses. So combine those two effects. Be safe out there. Be safe out there. And the world, at least the world you perceive, is there's a threat that comes at me, and the perps I lock up are all of a particular kind. There's a dangerous, cynical shortcut that can lead to. Very dangerous. And so one of the ways to deal with it is call it out and talk about it. And like I said, about those officers who work overnight and never get to see the good people hanging out, change their shifts so they can see things differently. But I'm just telling you, the way human beings are, and look, I can see it on the other side. If I'm a 19-year-old black man coming home from the library, and I've read a lot and heard a lot and had my friends talk about and seen things that police have done, I got a pretty dark view of those police officers. And when they come at me, I'm worried about what they're going to do to me. So the challenge for all of us is to understand those shaping experiences and do not let them be our destiny. But it is a hard, hard question. It really is.
We have time for one last question.
Okay. No?
She's in charge.
Sorry.
I think they need you to do it.
Hello, how are you?
Good thing.
So I know that you spoke about having a black student in college and serving black students at your university, but as a white man, what gives you the credibility to lecture black students on race?
Well, I hope you didn't hear me to be lecturing on race. I hope you heard me to be offering a perspective as a white man with a certain set of life experience on these problems. But the credibility of all of us is just in our logic and our perspectives. And so I have no more credibility than anybody else sitting here because I don't have the same experience of everybody here. And so I would hope if you see me saying something that seems illogical or framed wrong or not based on the right facts, you'll push back. And that's my goal, is to learn more about law enforcement and race. I know a lot from this perspective and from trying to get the perspective of other people, but I hope you heard me say I'm a long way from perfect and would benefit from the experience and perspectives of others.
Great.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of President Wayne Frederick, I want to thank each of you for joining us this evening. We certainly want to thank the Honorable James Comey for this first session, and also Ms. Goodwin for moderating this and for the excellent questions that you've asked. As we prepare to wrap up, I want to also remind everyone that there's a reception taking place, and it will be to the north on your way out. And it just occurs to me as we've started this conversation, it was nice to actually hear you behind the microphone this evening, but these conversations, at least today, could only occur at Howard University. Howard is a special place, and I think we should be honored to have speakers who are willing to come and share perspectives that we may not otherwise have heard, and to get a sense of a different way to see the world, but also a perspective of what can I learn from Howard University that will also help frame my vision of what the world is and what we can all make of it. So please join me in thanking Mr. Comey and Ms. Goodwin this evening, and we look forward to your joining us at the next scheduled event.